I take you now to the northern coast of England, to the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria, a location of peace and tranquility where monks engaged in discipline of prayer and meditation. At least until June 8th, 793. Where, according to Alcuin, heathens desecrated God's sanctuaries and poured the blood of saints within the compass of the altar, destroyed the house of our hope, trampled the bodies of saints in God's temple like animal dung in the street. What can we say except weep with you in our hearts before the altar of Christ and say, spare thy people, O Lord, and give not thine heritage to the Gentiles, lest heathen should say, where is the God of Christians? This date, June 8th, 793, is generally considered the dawn of what we have come to know as the Viking Age. It's for my brother. In the 50 years to follow, there are reported attacks in Scotland and Wales along the English coast, accounts of over 40 raids in Ireland alone. In 845, Paris had been sacked. Hamburg, in present-day Germany, was overrun the next year. London was invaded in 851. 859, raids had begun on islands throughout the western Mediterranean. 860, Vikings had actually launched an attack on the great walled city of Constantinople. By 862, it had become standard practice across northern Europe to hand over vast quantities of silver in order to prevent an attack by an approaching ship. By 880, Norsemen had secured control of Kiev, a group named the Rus, who would found and dominate what we now call Russia. By 911, a group of Norsemen had been given control of most of northern France, an area we call Normandy, as a ransom to prevent further attacks. Later on that same year, the Byzantine emperor himself will actually start hiring mercenaries called the Varangian Guard. These are Swedish and Rus, who will be his personal bodyguards for the next 200 years. By 1091, Sicily was firmly in the hands of a Viking army. Yet we have trouble making sense of these people, because despite their influence, they were not an empire. They were not a kingdom. For 300 years, the entirety of the Western world was shaped by the frequent and unpredictable arrival of people that seemed to take on a nearly mythical power. And yet we know very little about them. They call them Vikings. Now, whatever the early etymology of the word, and there's a lot of debate on that, what this came to be thought of is a pejorative term implying barbarian raiders. And so Viking terms is not what they called themselves, it's what other people called them. The reality of them is not so much this, because this is what we think of, right? We think of these harsh people rushing forward, attacking, looting, destroying, ripping apart, a lot of blood and gore. You can watch the History Channel, they give plenty of it today. Or we think of this lovely fellow. Hopefully, most of you know about him. The reality obviously is a bit different, otherwise we wouldn't be saying this. These were pragmatic sailors and opportunists, as equally likely to raid or trade, to ransom or trade as they were to raid. In fact, on many of these expeditions, they seemed to do all three. They would launch a raid on one place, extract a ransom from their neighbor, and then take what they had looted and trade on a kind of continuing course along the way home. Evidence suggests, and there's little evidence, but evidence suggests that they were much more profitable as traders in the slave trade than anything else. And so that seems to be one of the primary dominant forces for them. What we can't deny is they were scary. They were feared throughout the Western world. They were thought of kind of as boogeymen. They were seen as kind of, as you could imagine parents saying, you know, do your homework or your Vikings will come get you. This kind of idea. Anyways, what do we know? Unfortunately, not all that much. They did not keep accounts themselves. They did not have a written record. They did use something called runes, but this was mostly funerary inscriptions. The tales we have of them are those that are given to us primarily by monks who they raided. So you can imagine the tales and why we get the versions we do. The accounts we do have are what we call the Icelandic sagas. They come from the late 10th and 11th centuries. They aren't written down for about 200 years later in Iceland, hence Icelandic sagas. And when they are written down, there tends to be sorcerers and monsters in a lot of them. So, problem with some of that. Oh yeah, and they didn't wear horns. I'm sorry. They may have worn horns in honesty, but the legacy of the horns, it comes from operatic performances in the 19th century, and it just kind of stuck. I'm sorry about that. We'll cross that over there. And it's a very hot hat as well. Okay, so I've told you what they're not, and I told you what I don't know, which is a lot. But we need to move on to what we do know. And obviously, I have spent the last couple of years dealing with and trying to investigate just who these Norsemen were. And of course, most recently, spent 6 weeks this summer sailing the Draken Harald Harfagre, which is the largest Viking ship in the world, or currently largest Viking ship in the world. We spent 6 weeks sailing the coast of Norway, along with crew of historians, maritime preservationists, primitive shipbuilders, and some of the most renowned square sailors in the world. And after all this, for what I have to you today is really just simply one major conclusion. That despite the image of the brutal invading Viking, the true nature of these Norsemen of the Viking Age, who they were and how they defined themselves was of that primarily of mariners and not raiders. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But to talk about that, we have to figure out who these people are. And we have to figure out that it's not one people. In fact, it's hundreds of different groups of people, and primarily three major groups. Of course, we know they come from Scandinavia. But what we have to understand is Scandinavia is obviously composed of some very different cultural entities. There's what we call Sweden and Gotland, that the area we now know as Sweden, as well as the Estonia in the Baltics. All of these areas are considered Vikings, but these people have had a well laid out trade kind of tradition for hundreds of years by this point. We have accounts of Roman emissaries who meet with these Gotlanders, who talk about them as these kind of great internal traders. And what we find is they spend most of their time during this 300 years of the Viking Age flying the inland waterways, down the Volga, down towards Russia, throughout these Slavic regions in Germany. These are the ones who set up the lines of trade with Constantinople. These are the ones who set up a ongoing line of trade with Baghdad, actually. The second group, of course, is the Danish, what we now call Denmark. And this is unique in itself due to the fact of their location. Not only is it going to be warmer and more hospitable down here, but of course this is the Carolingian Empire. This is Charlemagne and of course the Merovingian predecessors who have been attacking for several years. So in terms of self-preservation, the Danish people have solidified into a single kingdom. A single kingdom with a monarch who has complete control of that society. And They are one of the few areas that is able to hold off Charlemagne and his those who follow him simply by two things. One, they built a giant wall across here, and two, they have a significant enough navy to prevent from being invaded. What that means for them is, one, they hate Christians, and that becomes very obvious in some of their history. But two, that their raids are approved and regulated by their king, which means when these people go out raiding, it's 20 up to 200 ships. It's these mass invasions. These are the people who seize control of most of England. These are the people who will launch these massive expeditions that take much of the Mediterranean. But that's not the image we have of Vikings. We have those one or two ships who go out and attack and then leave. And that is actually what is labeled as the Northmen or the Norse or present-day Norway. And this is where I draw my personal accounts. These people are different in my mind because they are both the greatest innovators and the kind of preservers of this maritime legacy. So we're going to spend our time talking about them. And first and foremost, it's the landscape that we are talking about. The Norwegian coastline is an array of fjords, and the fjords is just a deep bay, if you want to think of it, that reach deep into the country to the extent that Norway itself has more miles of coastline than all the rest of Europe combined, if you can kind of fathom that. The majority of the country is rocky mountains, craggy shorelines, and when you sail across this, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh my gosh, it's beautiful, but I would not want to live here. Right? The land, because of this, is nearly impossible to travel overland. Or I wouldn't say impossible, inefficient to travel overland. And the availability of rich soil is very limited to a small group of valleys and meadows that are going to be back in and among these fjords. So what you have is the population, even today, is settled into tiny communities tucked back in these, at the ends of the fjords and along the coastline, which means they do not have the ability for a massive population expansion. Although it's very fertile soil because of what it is, they don't have much of anywhere to go. And it's amazing when you go around and you're sailing along this coastline and you look out at these villages, you don't have that traditional where you have a road and a line of houses here and a line of houses here. You have a situation where the village is typically set on a hillside and everything faces the water. The entire orientation of almost every Norwegian town, even today, faces the water itself. The traditional gift for a Norwegian child when they turn 16 is to give them a boat. This is the country with the highest per capita income in the world due to their offshore oil reserves. And it is not abnormal. In fact, it's commonplace for a family to maybe have one car and 3 or 4 boats. 1980s, it was impossible for 60% of the population to reach each other by road. They've gotten a lot of money since then. Things have changed. But even today, some of the major towns are still only accessible by ferry. Because they had kind of settled in these community and family units, they remained independent from one another. They were controlled by jarls. And we have this concept that a jarl is essentially a king. The reality is it's not. It can best be described as kind of a clan leader. They had very little power, and it was usually within one small fjord. So what you have is it was these community and family units that set sail in the 18th century, and it was these family units that are going to set this maritime legacy. These are the guys who attacked Limsfarne in Northumbria. These are the people who, over those first 50 years, had actually attacked all of those launched all those initial attacks in England, Wales, Scotland, etc. But what's fascinating is after this Viking Age took off and more Norse ships started flying the seas, what you had is this significant move to settlement among the Norse people. The Hebrides along the coast of Scotland, the Orkneys, the Shetlands a little higher up. And if you visit these places, what you notice is they're bare and windswept rocks. These places are completely treeless, and they remind you a great deal of the conditions of Norway. So, but let's be honest, this is what tends to impress most of us about the Norse maritime people. It's not just that they would go on these raids, it's at how far they went and how regularly they went there. By 1000, they had settled in North America. And a lot of people still like to debate this, but in my opinion, as well as in the opinion of most, the archaeological finds at Lonzo Meadows in northern Newfoundland give indisputable proof that they were there. Now, we think they may have only been there a couple decades, but they were indeed there. But we have to kind of understand how they got there. Obviously, we know they settled the Shetlands. The Scottish had actually settled the Shetlands. It's not a surprise. They're firmly in the Faroes by about 825. They had settled Iceland by about 860. Now, Iceland seems to be the big jump. We have conflicting stories on how they got there, but the story is simple. Somebody got lost. Here's the fascinating thing. When they arrived, there was a group of somewhere between 9 and 15 Irish monks living there. The Norse actually killed them. But we'll move on. The move from Iceland to Greenland, which impresses a lot of people, is actually very simple. From the kind of upper flanks of mountains in Iceland, you can look out and you can see Greenland. The thing about Greenland, if you are not aware, it's a big chunk of ice. And so nobody is going to go. They knew it was there starting in about 860, but it will take till 981, 982 for the conditions to be right. And the conditions that are right, according to the Icelandic sagas, are that a gentleman named Eric the Red was convicted of murder, and he was banished from Iceland. Turns out that a couple dozen years before, he had also been banished from Norway for committing murder. So he couldn't go back. So he set out. And when he set out, he found a big chunk of ice. But sailing the coastline, he eventually found a semi-fertile area in the southwest. And he settled there, and in order to promote it, to encourage people to come, he named it Greenland. Right? So, the story from there is actually quite unremarkable, according to the sagas, and we have two different ones who vary on who actually did this, but the story is the same. That somebody was heading from Iceland to Greenland, and they veered too far south. And veering too far south, they came to a land that was filled with the most massive trees he had ever seen, things that only the gods could live among. And he turned back, and when he reached Iceland, he told this story. 10 years, well, we think this happened about 990, 992, somewhere in there. When he got back, he told this story, and 10 years later, a young man named Leif will actually board the same ship, sail back on the same bearing, and found Vinland. Now, of course, Vinland means Vineland, which means vines as in grapes and wine. There were probably no grapes, and it was probably, again, sounds pretty attractive if you say come to the land of grapes. What we have, even if they were only there a couple decades, we have extensive records in terms of the trade that was going on between Greenland and Norway. From 1000 to 1408, there was somewhere between 5 and 40. That's what I mean by extensive. That's as good as we can get. 5 and 40 trips being done back and forth between Greenland and Norway, exclusively shipping high-quality wood stores. Trees. Problem. Greenland doesn't have trees. They don't have trees now. They didn't really have trees then. They have some basic shrubs. Which means that the only explanation, regardless of whether they were settled in Vinland, is that they were harvesting lumber from that coast. Now, whether they came down to Newfoundland or they were just harvesting it off of Labrador, we're not really sure. But they were clearly harvesting wood and shipping it back for 400 years. A constant shipment back and forth. This is not a culture that just got lost and made a trip there. This is a semi-frequent highway of nautical travel. And one thing we have to understand is kind of the distances. From Haugesund, which is the home base of the Draken Fairhair, it is 1.5 days to the Shetland Isles. It is 3 days from the Shetlands to the Faroes. This is sailing, of course. From the Faroes to Iceland, it's about 5 to 6 days. From Iceland to Greenland, it's only 2, maybe 3 days. And to get over to the coast of Labrador, it's just 3 more days. At most, you're talking about a 15-day trip with 4 stops along the way, which means it's doable if you have a ship that can handle what is one of the most ruthless sailing environments in the world. Off the tip of South America and the Northern Atlantic. These are kind of the 2 most difficult places to sail in the world. Which brings us to this guy. Because it's the ship we need to talk about. If you can create a ship that can handle these storms, you can actually travel this northern route. This is the Viking. I know, originally. It was built in 1892. And in 1893, a group of, I think possibly my personal heroes, hopped in this thing and sailed it across the North Atlantic to New York, up the Hudson River, rode it down the Erie Canal, and then sailed it across the Great Lakes to the Chicago World's Fair, the great Columbian Exposition that many of you have heard about. It kind of blew everybody away that it could be done. Because these guys, there was no motor, they did not have any safety equipment, they didn't have a lifeboat on this thing. They just went. I'm intimidated. But the point is, it can easily be done. The secret to the success, in fact, their entire identity of the Norse people is the way they reach these places. It is the Viking longship that gave them this advantage, this ability, and this very identity. It is the very legacy that I spent this summer trying to discover aboard the Draken Harfagre. So we need to look at that in the construction of this ship, because their identity is this ship. And the problem with the longboat is that it is big enough for a crew, but it is a war-based ship, and it can't transport a large number of people and goods, which means it is unlikely that the ship like this was actually used to consistently cross back and forth. What we have is very little. We do not have many written accounts of exactly what they look like. We have accounts of dragons rising out of the fog, right? That's most of the accounts we have. This is an inscription I tracked down. I thought it was going to be a little more impressive. In the Bjornafjord in southern Norway. And of course, this is the famous Bayeux Tapestry, the famous kind of tapestry commemorating the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion of England. Now, the problem is, that's as much of pictorial information as we really have, because they did not draw up plans. They did not draw up sketches, and even today, Norse shipbuilders do so by tradition, not by actually drawing out plans first. It's amazing, but they continue to build in this style. Which brings us to the question of how they may have done it, because what we do have is, at most we have 18 boats, or 18 pieces of boats we've found. And most of them are incomplete, most of them are primarily a keel. These are the 2 big ones. This is the Godstad, which was dug up in 1880. By the way, this is what they copied to build the Viking I just showed you. And that is the Osberg, which was they dug up in 1904. These are the only two fairly complete hulls that we have found. And therefore, most of what we have built has kind of based off these two. But again, these are both these longboats that seem problematic. Now, the work that has been mostly done on these other types of ship is the Roskilde Museum in Denmark. And there are two main ships that they've kind of focused on. The top one is the Knarr. And it is a merchant ship. It's a bit fatter, slower. It only takes a crew of 6 or 9. It's primarily to be sailed. There's a couple oars just for getting in and out of harbors. And so it's always just been assumed that that's how people moved around, that that's what they used. But we have accounts in the sagas that they did a lot more. So when in the Roskilde Bay, they found a 90-foot keel of a ship, and they found this in the 50s, we started looking back, and we have all these accounts of ships called dragons, or Drakens, same thing. And these Drakens are 80 to 130 feet long. They tended to carry a crew of 60 to 100, possibly 120 people. They are massive warships, some of which are claimed to have traveled long distances across the ocean. This was the attempt to rebuild one. In 2007, they completed it. It's called the Sea Stallion. Many of the guys I sailed with over the summer were actually crews, and in fact, the captain of the Sea Stallion is now the captain of the Draken, Harald. And when I sat down to talk to him, he told me about taking this thing out. The first time they took it out, it is 90 feet long, it is 12 feet wide, and it started bending and flexing, and within about 20 minutes, it was actually popping nails. They actually had, according to his story, and he may have been drinking too much, but it was a hilarious story, people were hanging off the side with hammers actually nailing it back together just to get it towed back into shore. Well, they took it back into shore, they fortified it up, and they sailed it to Ireland. And then the next summer they came back and they sailed it back from Ireland. And they discovered one very important thing. This is not an ocean-going vessel. What they discovered is this vessel was clearly built for coastal warfare. It is not a vessel made for open ocean-going activity. All of this, of course, brings us to the Draken. The idea of this project, launched back in 2008, after the Sea Stallion, was to build a ship along the designs that the people of the time were using the same techniques that they did back then, and inferring a lot, of course, and based on the sagas and the descriptions that we have, that could sail the open oceans, and carry enough people to do so. And capable of making a voyage to the United States, which, if everything goes well, they will be doing in July and August of this year. To do this, they built the ship in the old style. Now, they did use some power tools for some of the basic work, and in the process took off a year of work. But what's amazing about these ships is that a modern ship is designed to plow through the waves and slice through the water. The Draken in a Viking ship is designed to actually absorb every single wave. It's designed to sail up and over the waves and around the waves. And what's amazing, when you are looking, you can see that front end flexing back and forth. The two, kind of what we would think of as dragon head and tail, actually do this in high winds. And when you stand on the gunwale, the top piece on the side, if you stand there, and as I did my first time out, and look down the side, you notice that the entire side of the boat, with every wave, just ripples. Which I have to tell you is one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. But once you get comfortable with the fact that this is secure enough, you realize how smooth it is. You realize that these boats, which shouldn't be able to do this, were designed to be able to take this kind of punishment. All right. But how'd they do it? Because that's the question. The question is of construction. Now, a traditional wooden boat of the age is built in what we would call a cable build or a cable style, or carvel, excuse me. You build a massive frame. You build a massive frame the exact shape you want, and then you plank it over and seal it off. No surprise, right? You always start with the keel, of course, but the Vikings or the Norsemen actually build a ship where you start with the keel and then you put an overlapping layer of planks, ever increasing on the outside, actually building the hull first before you actually put any of the internal supports. Once you've actually built this up, how you actually do this is through clinking, hence the clinker style of construction. You actually lay one board on top of another. You take an iron nail, if you will, and a small iron piece that has already been punched through, and you simply clink them together by smacking one. You hold a large chunk of iron on one side and nail it again and again and again and again until you have tightened the wood watertight. Of course, there's tar and usually wool in between as a layer. It takes an average of 100 to 120 strikes for each peg. There are thousands of these on the boat. And by the way, you get to reclink them every year just to make sure it's watertight. Once you put this all together, and you build up the sides, only then do you actually kind of build in the internal supports, which means that the frames or the ribs are actually cut to conform to the shape of the hull. What you're doing is you are letting the natural grain of the wood and the natural shape of the boat form as it may to require that flexibility and only putting in internal support. Then, to hook all of the ribs together and the various supports, you use these, or these. They're two sizes for you. And these are simply wooden nails. And the idea of the wooden nail is very simple. On the internal frame, this actually gives some flex, so that it's not just the outer hull that flexes back and forth. The actual entire structure of the boat has flex to it. You can look at all of this stuff at the end. And this is actually clinked together, so you can see how it's finished off. That being said, of course, the last thing you need to do is tar the entire structure. And tar is what you think of when I say tar. Thick, black, heavy stuff that we lived in. It was on your pants, it was on your clothes, it was in your hair. If you smell this, that's my tar I brought back from Norway, possibly illegally, because also the ropes are tarred and everything else. And it looks like we have this great open ship with plenty of room. But you forget something. It's a big wooden tub. And big wooden tubs, when they fill with water, sink. Which means the primary goal is keeping this thing upright, which requires somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 tons of ballast stones. So once you put 15 to 20 tons of ballast stones in the bottom of this thing, and you put enough food to sustain you for 5 or 6 days, and you add whatever other kind of construction materials to put it back together, as it have problems at sea, all of a sudden you realize that there was barely enough room to store the gear for the 30 sailors we had, much less the 100, literally, 102 people it would take to actually row this ship. That these ships were made to be manned by hardened marine or mariners ready to endure blazing heat, bitter cold, and days of discomfort. Because where you are living is on deck. There is no down below. There is no hiding on a Norseman ship. No matter what the conditions, no matter what the rains, this is where you live, as I discovered, to both excitement and displeasure. But the ship itself, let's be honest, it's a creature of extreme beauty. It's 115 feet long. It's 25 feet across. It's got this 3,200 square foot silk sail, which I have a piece I snagged right here. These silk sails, probably not as historically accurate as we thought when we first tried it. Again, but the amazing thing is when it glides through the water, the asymmetrical hull, meaning it looks the same one way as it does the other, moves through the water without creating a single ripple. Within 10 feet behind this boat, you cannot even tell it was there. The draft is 3.5 feet. A boat this size of any other make was actually drawing about 15 feet, which means they could sail this thing up any river and most streams. When we pulled in at night, we actually tied this thing up alongside cliffs. We would pull this up to the edge of beaches. We'd actually backed it directly to the side of land and rocks to the point that we could step off of it onto land. A 115-foot ship that you just step right onto the shore. When we start to think about that, what we realize is why people maybe started to see these things as kind of ghosts or demons, or the Vikings themselves, because they could appear, arrive, and leave. They seemed like ghosts. It was this day. It was only a day and a half in. A week and a half in. That I kind of got a true feel for what was going on. We backed right up to the edge of shore. We climbed the cliff to the side there. And when I looked down, this is what I saw. And it struck me that in this land of fjords, this landscape of Norway, I could have seen this scene probably 1,000 years ago and it would have looked exactly the same. A small settlement by a stream and a tiny little enclave right on the edge of the water, a protected spot, and a Viking ship sitting there. We were actually living in much the same way they had, although we did have a John Deere engine on board just in case. But to do this, to sail, whether you be a Viking or you be a modern day Viking, what we have to know is that there's more than just sailing. There's more than the boat. There are thousands and thousands of feet of rope. Most of it hemp. We're still kind of vague on what they use. There's a lot of postulations about it. We, in order to get enough hemp rope together, had to actually contract with a group of farmers in China because they were the only ones who could produce enough quality hemp to actually make rope for the ship. So we spent most of our days splicing and wrapping and resetting these sails, trying to figure out the right configuration for how they actually sailed this thing. Days and days of cleaning. These ships, one of the amazing things, require absolute attention. Weekly attention. If you let grit get down in between these boards, what will happen is it will start loosening up these boards. This is one of the problems with clinker-style building. And did I mention lots of tarring? By the way, no matter how many times you shower and wash your clothes, when you go into these towns, there's about an 8-foot barrier around you. People would just not come near you. But These are sailing ships. So we should talk a little about this. But the point about all this work is very simple. From a young age, the entire community would have had to work on these ships. A single person or a single crew would not be enough to maintain these ships without working on them at least 3 days a week, which meant that these ships were maintained by the entire community, so by a young age, people would be intimately familiar with all parts of these ships. Now, as much as we know about these ships, and as much as we have learned through the years about sailing a long ship, these 20 to 60 feet long ships, we didn't know how to sail this thing. Honestly, they were supposed to come, this past summer they were supposed to sail to the Mediterranean, but they realized when they launched this thing, sailing a ship of 20 feet is very different from sailing a ship with a 3,200 square foot sail. The level of difficulty increased that we spent most of the summer just trying to figure out how to handle it. It's easy to sail downwind, right? The wind is at my back, you simply put up a square sheet and you go forward, right? And the traditional mindset of the time is to go into the wind. If the wind is at my face, is to take out your oars and row. That's how the Greeks did it. That's how everybody did it. Today, we use triangular sails that can be angled into the wind, and with the wind facing me, you can go at a 45-degree angle off the wind, sailing and tacking and sailing and tacking. The triangular sail had not been developed and used until the end of the Middle Ages. They independently developed it in Polynesia, China, and in the Islamic Mediterranean, but that's 400 years off. The Norse are the only people that we have any records of that ever developed a way to sail upwind with a square sail. Some of it has to do with the thin length of the boat. Most of it has to do with taking a square sail and stretching it at an angle across the ship as tightly and flatly as possible. Now, I could spend 20 minutes going into the details of how this is done. Actually, I could spend 4 hours. But safe to say, it requires the coordination and, for various reasons, the silent coordination of 15 different people, 6 different crews spread throughout the ship, all constantly working together to tack this ship. Pulling the sail, because they're pulling the same sail from every different angle. When it's done right, it's a thing of beauty and grace. If you, again, wind coming at me, if you take the sail, or as we were sailing into the wind, we would turn ever so slightly. The wind would catch us, back us up. We would catch the next breeze and take off like a shot. I mean, you could feel just how utterly smooth the boat carved through the water. If you did it incorrectly, the wind would catch you in the back and you would be knocked about 300 yards. And you would lose everything you just spent trying to accomplish over the last 30 to 45 minutes. And that happened a lot. The point is, I spent 6 weeks kind of training with a crew. The professional crew of 15 had spent almost a year training, and we could still get this right about 40% of the time. So the skill it required was really palatable. Above and beyond that, what you have to realize is the yard, which is the long kind of pole that goes horizontally. It hangs from a single rope. And, of course, the sail hangs directly from that down. On the Draken Harald Fairhair, it is 1.3 tons. It is 55 feet in length, 1.5 feet in diameter. And we have to haul that from the deck up to the top of the mast. What we actually do is we have to haul it halfway up the mast. We have to grab the ropes holding that end. We have to pull that down to the deck and get it underneath these shrouds, which are these these ropes that go from the side of the ship up to the top of the mast, and then gently release it up. Then we can pull it up the rest of the way. Not too hard when there's no wind, but when there's 20 knots, 22 miles per hour of wind, 9 of us can go splaying across the deck. This happened many times. It is probably the most dangerous thing that we deal with. Forget the fact that when the wind comes up, you have to drop it and kind of fix it up and then pull it back up again. That effort requires every person in the 30-member crew. Again, these people would have had to be so attuned to this. For 6 weeks, I spent the summer tweaking the rigging, improving the ballast, practicing sailing techniques. Although most days we weren't out for more than 14 hours due to regulations, those days that we sailed through the night and worked 4-hour shifts, 4-hour shifts on, 4-hour shifts off, were the most amazing. Constantly adjusting the sail, riding the waves, attempting to not hit anything in the pitch black night. We did not. Bundled up with sweaters and rain gears in the middle of August because the North Sea refuses to recognize the seasons. After 5 weeks, you actually just begin to learn to allow the boat to move underneath you, capable of standing up without tumbling over as you did in the first weeks. Without being able to see the wind vane on top of the mast in the night, you actually relied on the wind across your cheeks and how to set your sails. And that is how we would sail for the majority of the time. At shift change, we would actually, again, bundle or pile up along the sides for warmth on the deck. If it was truly raining, we could strip off our foul weather gear and move to the tent in back, which is designed to hold 10 people. And we would pack 15 to 16 in, all laying on our side. In fact, it was that last week, those last 2 days, while doing that, wedged between Ola, a gigantic Norwegian shipbuilder, and an equally large Danish navigator named Esben, that I got to understand just how close and how much of a community people had to be to sail on these open ships. It is these days I came to understand the identity of the Norse Vikings as mariners. Days and weeks at sea, facing any and all conditions requiring a fortitude and mindset beyond that of a warrior or a soldier, as the Vikings are so often portrayed. The majority of time of an expedition at sea, these Norsemen will face more dangers in the ocean than they ever will in combat on land. Setting forth as they did requires a belief and a consciousness as a man of the sea as one's most primary identity. The legacy of the Norse. They had a ship that can silently and efficiently be navigated across open ocean and inland waterways. They had developed the ability to sail into the wind at speeds that rival the fastest ships in the Western world downwind. They functioned as these independent units, which meant that there was no way to determine where they would strike and who they would attack. And if you negotiated with one group, that was no guarantee of safety from the next. They operated as these community units that had spent their entire life working and sailing as a family, meaning they had this ingrained skill set that cannot be trained in 10 years. They traveled further and more frequently on the open oceans than any people in Western history, hands down. When we pull all this together, the question seems less of why they dominated in Europe and were so feared as why that domination didn't continue. Thank you. That's it.